welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. In my last video, I made mention of Senate manipulation through the use of casual vacancies during the Whitlam period. It reminded me of the cracking story dubbed by one newspaper headline, "The Night of the Long Prawns." In more recent times, I've managed to dig out far more primary material about what actually happened at the time, which gives us a new perspective on it. And it also raises really interesting constitutional points. As some of you will remember, the Whitlam government in Australia had a very fraught relationship with the Australian Senate. Not only could, and indeed did, the Senate block landmark government legislation, but it could also block supply, being the budget bills that were necessary to appropriate the money that would fund the government. In 1974, a half-Senate election was looming. At that time, each state elected 10 senators, with 5 of them being elected at each half-Senate election every 3 years. It was also the case, prior to the 1977 constitutional amendment that I mentioned last time, that a casual Senate vacancy, while initially being filled by the Parliament of the state that the senator represented, would then be filled at the next half-Senate, or indeed House of Representatives election, regardless of how long the original term had left to run. This opened up the system to manipulation, because a half-Senate election to elect 5 members of the Senate could be turned into an election for 6 members, which would alter the party balance. Senator Vince Gair had been elected as a Queensland senator as an endorsed member of the Democratic Labor Party, the DLP, which was a party that had split from the Labor Party during the 1950s. Gair had recently lost the leadership of his party. He was disgruntled and he was open to receiving a government appointment. Gair's seat wasn't up for election at the 1974 half-Senate election, but if Gair resigned his seat to take up a government posting, then it meant 6 seats instead of the normal 5 seats would be filled in Queensland at that election, with the likely result that the Labor Party would win 3 out of 6 seats rather than 2 out of 5, which would ordinarily be the case. It was an easy way to bolster Labor's Senate numbers. So on the 13th of March 1974, the Labor Attorney General, Senator Lionel Murphy, asked Gair if he would accept the post of ambassador to Ireland, and Gair said yes. Now, this was done while the Minister for Foreign Affairs, who would normally be in charge of this, was overseas. This was Senator Willacy, and he later said that if he had been there, he would have been, quote, dead against, unquote, pulling, quote, such a trick. Instead, it was Gough Whitlam, the Prime Minister, who was also the Acting Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he joined with Lionel Murphy in holding a meeting with the Governor-General, Sir Paul Hasluck, the following day. Hasluck, fortunately, left written records of these meetings, so we know what happened. Hasluck queried how Gair could be appointed as an ambassador while still being a senator. As a former MP, Hasluck, of course, was conscious of the fact that members and senators were disqualified under Section 44 of the Constitution if they took up an office of profit under the Crown. An ambassadorial office was clearly an office of profit under the Crown. Whitlam and Murphy, however, satisfied Hasluck that his action in signing the Executive Council minute on the 14th of March merely involved the nomination of Gair, as distinct from his appointment. Ambassadorial appointments cannot actually be made without the other country agreeing. The Irish government gave its formal agreement, which is known in diplomatic terms as agrément, on the 19th of March, and the Commonwealth received that approval on the 20th of March. In the meantime, Gair had continued to sit and vote as a senator. On the 21st of March, the Executive Council approved a minute which provided for setting Gair's salary and his other terms and conditions of appointment, and stated that his appointment, quote, commences on and from a date to be determined by the Minister of State for Foreign Affairs, unquote. That Executive Council minute was discussed in a private meeting on the morning of the 21st of March by the Governor-General, Sir Paul Hasluck, along with Whitlam and Murphy. Hasluck recorded this about the meeting. We had a discussion during which I again raised the question about whether an appointment could be made while Senator Gair was still a member of the Senate, and if so, whether it would be a valid appointment. I also asked what would be the position of Senator Gair if he accepted another office under the Crown while still a senator. Was it necessary for him to resign first? Senator Murphy, Attorney General, spoke in a somewhat roundabout way, but he reassured me by saying that no appointment had yet been made. My approval was only approval of an intention to appoint, and the actual appointment would come later. Even the Executive Council minute, which we were to consider shortly, was not an appointment, but the approval of certain steps to be taken towards the making of an appointment, unquote. On the evening of Monday, 1st of April 1974, a government official leaked to a journalist at The Sun that a senior politician had accepted a diplomatic posting. By 11 p.m, the journalist, Laurie Oakes, had worked out by a matter of deduction that it must have been Vince Gair. He rang a Labor figure and said that he had uncovered the scheme. The response was a panicked, "Christ, how did you find out?" Then, to be absolutely sure, he rang Mrs. Gair and congratulated her, and she said, "Thank you, they were very pleased." Now, this was enough for a scoop that let the cat out of the bag on the morning of the 2nd of April. Gair had, at that stage, still not resigned as a senator, but he was expected to do so later that day. The one other constitutional oddity that you need to understand here is that the writs for the half-Senate elections are issued by state governors, not the Governor-General. And those state governors act upon the advice of their state premier, rather than the Commonwealth Government. The Queensland Premier, the National Party's Joe Bjelke-Petersen, on reading about Gair's proposed ambassadorial appointment, realised that if the Queensland Governor issued the writs for the impending half-Senate election immediately before Gair resigned, this would mean that only 5 seats would be filled at the half-Senate election, leaving Gair's vacant seat to be filled by a person appointed by the Queensland Parliament for the next 3 years. There was frantic scurrying in Queensland to get together all the necessary paperwork in order to issue the writs that day. In the meantime, National Party senators were given the task of distracting Gair so that he wouldn't resign before the writs could be issued in Queensland. The kitchen and the bar staff in Parliament House had chosen that week to go on strike. In what then became known as the Night of the Long Prawns, a hungry Gair, alienated by his own party, was lured into the office of a Queensland National Party senator by the offer of fresh Townsville prawns and beer. When the division bells rang at 10 p.m, the National Party senator accompanied Gair to the chamber to vote. The vote on the crucial Petroleum and Minerals Authority Bill, which spawned its own High Court constitutional case, provided evidence that Gair still regarded himself as a senator and had not yet resigned. The writs were issued shortly afterwards by the Queensland Governor at 11 p.m. on the 2nd of April for 5 seats, as no casual vacancy had yet occurred by Gair's resignation. The following morning, Whitlam and Murphy discovered that they had been outplayed in Senate manipulation by Joe Bjelke-Petersen and a bucket load of prawns. They repaired to Whitlam's office along with Sir Maurice Byers, who was the Solicitor General, and Sir John Bunting, who was the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Here we have the record of John Bunting as to what happened. So according to Bunting's record, Murphy then proposed that they, quote, take the line, unquote, that a casual vacancy had occurred earlier because they could argue that Gair had been disqualified for holding an office of profit under the Crown and that this occurred either at the initial Executive Council meeting on the 14th of March or later on the 20th of March. Now, this was the complete opposite of what Murphy had very recently advised the Governor-General on 2 occasions. Bunting recorded that, quote, the Solicitor General indicated his concurrence in what the Attorney General said, unquote. Byers was sent off to write an opinion to this effect, while Murphy went off to write a statement for Gair to give to the President saying that he had been disqualified earlier. Bunting recorded that he was, quote, anxious that the Prime Minister in particular and the Attorney General as well should understand one of the implications of what was now being decided. This was that the date of vacation of office, this is Bunting of course, which I took to be probably 14th of March, but at any rate not later than 21st of March, Gair had continued to take his place in the Senate. This seemed to me to be a contempt of the Senate and to be contrary to law. But not only that, the Prime Minister and the Attorney General must be taken to have known. This will reflect on the Prime Minister, and perhaps seriously, unquote. Bunting then noted in his impeccably dry public service language that, quote, the Prime Minister noted the point, unquote. Neither Whitlam nor Murphy were deterred. Hansard then records a comedic farce. Murphy and Whitlam couldn't get their stories straight. They each argued in different houses for different dates of disqualification. The annoyed Minister for Foreign Affairs took a third view, stating that Gair had not taken up the post until the 3rd of April, which was after the date that the writs were issued. Byers' opinion was tabled in the Senate. When Murphy was asked why he had not objected to Gair voting if he knew that Gair was disqualified, Murphy bizarrely said it would not have mattered except for the Queensland Government's actions in issuing the writs. In other words, the law and the Constitution don't matter unless you get caught breaching them or there's some other political damage caused like losing your ability to manipulate a half-Senate election. Murphy relied on Byers' advice regarding disqualification. He moved a motion to have the matter referred to the Court of Disputed Returns, but the Senate then amended that motion to declare instead that Gair was still a senator as at the 3rd of April. It went on then to censure the government and call on it to resign. Byers then advised that there was a powerful argument that the House no longer had the power to decide under Section 47 of the Constitution about the qualification or disqualification of a senator. Section 47 says, until the Parliament otherwise provides, any question respecting the qualification of a senator or a member of the House of Representatives or respecting a vacancy in either House of Parliament and any question of a disputed election to either House shall be determined by the House in which the question arises. Byers argued that the Parliament had now otherwise provided, and the exclusive forum for determining such matters was now the Court of Disputed Returns. He also advised that the Queensland writ was unenforceable, while a question as to whether a place has become vacant in the Senate was unresolved. He considered that the Commonwealth Electoral Officer therefore could disregard the writ. He advised that proceedings should be taken in the High Court seeking a declaration that the writ was invalid. Such proceedings were indeed commenced. Interestingly, it was a solicitor Morgan Ryan, representing a person who proposed to stand in the half-Senate election, who commenced the proceedings. Morgan Ryan later achieved notoriety as Murphy's little mate in criminal proceedings that were later brought against Murphy for attempting to pervert the course of justice. The Senate used the Gair Affair to justify blocking supply. Whitlam abandoned his attempt at manipulating the Queensland half-Senate election and instead called a double dissolution, which means that all Senate and House of Representatives seats are vacated and filled in a fresh election. As for Byers' opinion on the disqualification of Gair, does it stack up? Byers argued that Gair held an office of profit under the Crown and was therefore disqualified from Parliament from the time the first Executive Council meeting was passed on the 14th of March. Byers concluded, quote, "I think the better view is that a person holds an office of profit, notwithstanding that he has not either commenced his duties or received his salary, or that the appointment is expressed to be operative as from a future date," unquote. Funnily enough, all governments since then seem to have rejected Byers' opinion. Otherwise, it would have resulted in the instantaneous disqualification of numerous MPs who have, in the past, agreed to take up lucrative government posts, such as being an ambassador, but did not resign until a much more convenient time, some months later. There are good policy grounds, however, to follow Byers' wider approach. The key justification for this disqualification is to prevent offers of lucrative postings from being used to influence the voting and the behaviour of sitting MPs. It is actually an anti-corruption measure that is thwarted if such posts can not only be dangled before MPs, but promised and agreed upon to be taken up at a future date after their retirement from politics. From a political point of view, the Gair Affair led to further attempts to manipulate the composition of the Senate through casual Senate vacancies. When a casual vacancy occurred due to the appointment of Attorney General Lionel Murphy to the High Court, the New South Wales Parliament appointed the Albury Mayor, Cleaver Bunton, to fill the vacancy. Bunton was an independent. Although he opposed some of the Labor Party's policies, he supported Labor on the crucial issue of the passage of the supply bills during the 1975 constitutional crisis. If the New South Wales Liberal government had wanted to appoint a Liberal stooge to the Senate, it too failed in the manipulation stakes. When Labor Senator Bert Milner from Queensland died, the Queensland Parliament rejected Labor's nominee, Mal Colston, who later, somewhat ironically, after becoming a senator, then defected from the Labor Party in order to become Deputy President of the Senate. Instead, the Queensland Parliament appointed Albert Field, who was, technically, a Labor Party member, but he was one who was philosophically opposed to many of the policies of the Whitlam government. Questions were raised again over Field about whether he was disqualified under Section 44 of the Constitution. So he took leave from the Senate while his position was under challenge. So he was actually absent from the Senate during the 1975 constitutional crisis. As I pointed out previously, these machinations and attempts at manipulation were prevented by the 1977 constitutional amendment, which changed the way that Senate casual vacancies are filled. But it does go to show if you leave any loophole or any possibility of political manipulation, politicians will use it, won't they? Thank you again for watching the Constitutional Clarion, and as always, I hope to see you again next time. Goodbye.